Hi everybody, thank you for making the time to come and listen to my musings today about consumer and shopper behaviour changes. We're a fairly small group, but I think it makes sense to keep the chats as Yasmin was talking about. But you know, sort of obviously, if there's anything that you haven't heard or anything that I've skipped over, you haven't understood or whatever, then you can maybe use the sort of hand icon or say something on the chat that if you really can't continue without actually getting clarity on anything I've said, then do feel free to do so. So Yasmin will sort that out for me, because once I share my screen, I won't be able to see most of that because I'm not very good on adjusting Zoom adjustments to being able to see what I want to see all the time. So I'm going to share with you now. Make sure I share the right thing. There we are. So yeah, just a little bit about myself first. I'm actually a very, very recent joiner to the Hereford and Worcestershire Chamber. I think it was only about 3 weeks ago. I've been thinking about it for months and finally took the plunge about 3 or 4 weeks ago. My business is an insights consultancy business, so that is a posh way of saying I do market research. I have done that throughout the whole of my career, and I specialise in shopper and retail insights. I was employed up until January 2019 working for other people, but I finally decided it was time to take the plunge to set up my own business. So I've been running Tracer now for just over 1.5 years. Wasn't really expecting a pandemic to interrupt the second year of business growth, but there we go, we're still here and things are going okay actually. But obviously that pandemic has changed an awful lot of things for an awful lot of people, so we're going to look at a bit of that today. And I'll take you through my thoughts. The first thing I'd like to talk about is really that we don't operate in a vacuum as human beings. We always operate within a context, and context is absolutely everything. And that context is what almost determines our behaviour, if you like, and it certainly determines behavioural change. So there are several different types of context. There's the environmental context. This is about the infrastructure around us. What channels have we got available to us to buy from? What products are there available to buy? Loo roll was a little bit lacking in the early days, for example. Then we have social context, which is about the societal rules and also how we as human beings behave within a society. The personal context is our own personal, how we feel, do and respond. And then of course there's the economic context as well. And the important thing really is to stress that with a lot of these contexts, they're often way beyond our own individual control, and anything that changes within the environmental, social and economic context will typically drive what you might call a forced behavioural change rather than an elective behavioural change. And that's quite an important distinction, because what we tend to see is that forced behavioural changes tend not to stick around. They're not as sticky as elective behavioural changes we've made because that behaviour better reflects our own beliefs, our own needs and our own way of thinking. That's not always the case, of course, because a forced change might have been, for example, back in the 2008 credit crunch disaster. We saw the emergence of the savvy shopper come out, and actually that savvy shopper remained with us until this day, because actually that became an elective way of shopping when people actually found that that was actually better for them to shop in that way. So it's always a dynamic relationship. But if we look at what's been happening for each of these different types of context. So as I said, for the environmental context, this is all about what choice the infrastructure has to offer for us. And from this perspective, obviously, one of the big changes is that we all shifted our shopping online because simply we couldn't do it anywhere else, particularly for non-food, of course. So before non-essential retail was opened up once more, there was 62, nearly 2/3 of all retail sales went online. And in fact, that is one of the behavioural changes that our industry is predicting will probably stick, not necessarily to the extent that it is now, but some of those online adopters, either fresh adopters or they've adopted more types of buying different things online, most of those will stick at least with part of that behaviour. And we're still seeing online penetration rates increasing even though retail has opened up. So we're now looking at 42% online penetration versus 30% this time last year. If we look at the social perspective, this is about the rules, the laws, the government guidelines and whatnot, albeit with varying levels of clarity that we're actually being asked to adhere to and take note of. And to be fair, the population by and large, with some notable exceptions called Dominic Cummings, have largely responded. And actually, if you remember back to the early days of lockdown, you know, there was almost that wartime spirit and that growing sense of community mindedness that evolved when we all worked really hard to go against the grain of our humanity, if you like, which is very typically very focused on looking after ourselves and our own, to adopting this more altruistic behaviour of looking after the interests of society at large. Staying at home, social distancing, they weren't there just to look after ourselves, they were there also to protect others. And more recently, of course, the introduction of face masks is absolutely, or so we're told anyway, about protecting others. They're not there to stop us from potentially contracting the virus, but they're there to make us less likely to give it to somebody else. So that's very much about altruistic behaviour. But it isn't just government advice and regulations that creates the social context. We create our own social context as well. So as human beings, the more we see or hear about other people doing certain things or doing things differently, the more likely we are subconsciously to start to adopt those behaviours ourselves. And it's something that we call social proof in the behavioural science world. And it's a very powerful and natural force that helps us to ensure the wider adoption of ideally good behaviour. But of course, while good behaviour breeds good behaviour, bad behaviour breeds bad behaviour as well. So the psychology of herding, or the psychology of social proof, is such that if we see lots of people sitting on a beach, for example, we may start to think subconsciously that it's not so bad after all. And particularly at times when our resolve is somewhat depleted because we've already gone through weeks and months of deprivation. And we are hearing lots of negative opinions as well about certain topics. So the keyboard warriors denouncing the benefits of, for example, wearing face masks, or for example, social distancing, will have a lot to answer for when it comes to the increasing levels of non-compliance that we're beginning to see, although thankfully most people are still behaving themselves reasonably well. But if we get back to shopping for a minute, the new and evolving social context that we live in and the forced changes in how we therefore are living our lives have resulted in lots of different ways of shopping versus what we used to do before. So if we go back to May, and this is data from a company called Kantar, it's one of the biggest insight companies in the world actually, and they track shopping behaviour across a panel of thousands and thousands of people. And in the 3 months to the 17th of May, so from just before the pandemic to the early days of strict lockdown, we saw 100 million fewer grocery shopping trips versus last year. The average trip spend increased. It doesn't look much, but that's on average. That's nearly 50% higher than in normal times. We spent a huge amount more on grocery because, of course, we were all staying at home and we weren't going out, we weren't going to work, we weren't going to the pub, and a lot of that shifted to online as well. The big question, as I've said before, within certainly my community, professional community, is how much of this behaviour is going to stick. And it still is a big question. But what we do know is that habits do take a long time to form. And forced behavioural changes, as I said, are not necessarily as sticky. So I predicted back in June when I gave a similar webinar that actually we would start to see a reversion to normal shopping behaviour reasonably soon, particularly in grocery, where that's a very habitual form of shopping that people repeat week in, week out. So the previous habits were very, very strong. So more recently, now looking at the rolling 3-month data to the beginning of this month, indeed, that's exactly what we've seen. So grocery shopping trips trip frequency has steadily increased again. Before COVID, we were seeing what we call the fragmentation of shopping trips. So the traditional big, fortnightly trolley shopping trip was beginning to decline in favour of lots more basket shopping trips as people were shopping more frequently, shopping in convenience stores and so on. And we're heading back towards that sort of grocery shopping again now. Certainly not there yet and quite a long way off, but that's the way that we're headed. The average trip spend has fallen as a result of that. And in fact, in terms of the growth of grocery spend, although we're still seeing significant growth because we're still spending more time at home, we're still sort of going to the pub a little bit less, so more of that alcohol is being bought to eat at home. We're still having lunch at home because we're working at home, but that growth is actually on the decline. What's not declining, however, is the proportion of people that are shopping online for their groceries. But the social context doesn't just change how we shop, it also changes what we buy, because as shoppers, we only buy things to serve consumer needs and wants. And of course, those consumer needs and wants will vary depending on the social context around us. So going on holiday, I don't know how many of you guys have actually made it abroad. We in our family decided that it really wasn't worth the hassle. It was either impossible, difficult, or just fraught with uncertainties. And so a lot of people, like myself and my family, have opted for staycations. As a result, camping gear, outdoor wear, that sort of thing, sales have rocketed. We all sat for months, weeks and months staring at our own four walls, decided that it was high time that something was done about the state of our homes, and therefore furniture and homewares, DIY, decorating materials, sales of those sorts of categories have soared. Many of us have ended up working from home. I, by the way, have worked from home for the last 16 years. There was no change for me there, luckily. But computing equipment, electrical equipment, sales of those categories have soared. And more recently, as some of us have come out of lockdown, perhaps feeling a little bit more sluggish than we were when we went in, the sales of well-being products have also increased, so vitamins and supplements and so on, as we want to stay or get healthier, particularly with the messages coming from the government that, that will help our cause should we, God forbid, contract the virus ourselves. On the other hand, of course, what we're seeing is that certain categories like fashion are suffering considerably. Again, we're working from home. We don't need to buy new clothes to go to work. We're not going out as much. We don't need to buy new clothes to go out. And much as though buying clothes is actually a discretionary spend and an indulgent spend, it is one that has fallen by the wayside for people, because if they can't see a purpose for getting a new top or a new suit or a new whatever it may be, there's no point in buying it and sticking it straight in the wardrobe. And the point of all of this really is that for anybody within this group, or anybody that within your networks that you can pass these messages on to, whether it's physical or digital retailers, how important it actually is to keep on top of how consumer and shopper needs are evolving. So already in the matter of just a few months, we've seen vast changes in how consumers and shoppers are responding because of the evolving environmental context, because of the evolving social context. And that means that basically the personal context is still actually quite a roller coaster of risk avoidance and uncertainty for many, because they're struggling to actually get to grips with any degree of certainty around normality, because there is continued uncertainty. And unfortunately, that continued uncertainty is not helped by less than clear communication coming from our esteemed leaders. I think we can probably all agree on that. And of course, the powerful shock that the pandemic delivered, this is not something that any of us have experienced previously in our lives, and it's hopefully something that we won't again. And it will take time for people to readjust, but readjust we will, because our brains are predisposed to actually reintroduce equilibrium, but that takes time. And what we've seen in some research data is that consumer optimism, whilst it's certainly recovered from its dire position in the dark days of March, is still languishing behind what we would normally expect. So that would be the results that were picked up here by an agency called Kokoro. Net optimism at 44%. That's, you know, the difference between those people who are highly optimistic and those who are not optimistic. Reached back up again to a peak in May when Captain Tom was doing his thing, and that gave us all a sort of a bit of a boost. But we're seeing it decline again now through to August, when we're starting the confusion around holidays. We're starting to sit up as well the coffee around the economic impact of all of this, although I'll come back to that because that's actually happening quite slowly out there in consumer land. So we're not there yet by any stretch. We're a little bit better, in a better position than we were back in March, but things don't seem to be heading in the right direction even now. So that is basically evidenced in the slow revival, particularly of physical retail. So if you cast your minds back to the early days of June, when people were queuing like crazy outside IKEA or outside McDonald's or outside Primark and numerous other retailers, there was a hope that that was some kind of a note that we were all going to snap back to normal, you know, sort of immediately. But of course that didn't happen. And what that really was the general population scratching that itch that they felt to return to some semblance of normality as soon as they could. And that normality evidently, you know, involved going to buy a piece of flatback furniture and getting a McDonald's on the way home. It was good while it lasted, but it gave false hope, as I said, because what we've seen since is that UK footfall, particularly in physical retail, is not actually getting back to its former glories by any stretch of the imagination. Retail spend is actually moving up. So the consumer economy is beginning to kick in a little bit, not as fast and as much as we need it to, but actually for the physical retail community, things are still pretty tough. So this is something that I picked up from the Telegraph yesterday. It's sourced by a company called Springboard, who do footfall counting across all the retail locations here in the UK. And basically what it's saying is once we've scratched that itch, that's it, it's done, and we're not going to scratch it again anytime soon. The growth in footfall is extremely slow, and we can see that the retail parks, the top line there, are the ones that are benefiting, where high streets and shopping centres are still languishing at 50% or less levels of footfall versus the same period last year. So physical retail was hurting before, of course, but it's in agony now, and that's obviously evidenced by the horrible stories that we're hearing about store closures and redundancy. Most latterly, of course, M&S's announcement that 7,000 people were going to be made redundant yesterday. So there's lots of reasons for this slow return if we look at how people are responding and what consumers are telling us. So basically that nervousness is still around. What we're seeing is that, according to a survey done on behalf of the BRC, the British Retail Consortium, 42%, only 42%, even now at the beginning of August, with the retailers having been opened for close to 2 months, are feeling comfortable shopping in non-essential retailers. And yet, most of them think that the retailers are doing as much as they can to make that a safe experience. So it's something within themselves that's keeping them from actually coming out there. There's also that whole thing about the fact that people did go shopping, but actually they didn't really get the experience that they were expecting. It is not the same shopping now as it were in pre-COVID days. So 42% of people saying that shopping is less enjoyable now. Obviously, in the earlier days, we were seeing more queues. Things have settled down, but queues are just a big fat no-no. 47% of people saying, I just don't like the queues. Why would I go and do that when I can sit on my sofa at home and buy whatever I want online? And of course, more latterly, we're seeing a little bit of an unintended consequence coming through with the masks, whereas they were originally introduced to maybe add confidence for consumers to be able to go out to store knowing that they're not going to be infecting anybody else and other people aren't going to be infecting them and so on. What's actually happening is actually making people feel a little bit uncomfortable, and particularly obviously over the last few weeks with the heats that we've been experiencing, it has been really quite uncomfortable. So people are going back to shops because it's not as enjoyable as it used to be. They're not getting the experience that they're looking for. The other reason, of course, is that they're loving online. So those people that have either started to shop full stop or started to shop more are finding, not everyone, of course, many people have had really bad experience and would never touch online again, but a lot of people are finding that actually this is actually quite a good way of doing my shopping, whatever the category is. And in fact, at this present point in time, and this does link back to nervousness a little bit, nearly 2/3 or just over 2/3 of people feel most comfortable when they're shopping on online marketplaces, versus just under a third of people who are saying they feel most comfortable when they're shopping in physical stores. Another reason for the slow return, of course, is that we're not going to the places where the shops are. We're all working from home, or we're furloughed, or unfortunately for some people already, redundancy has kicked in. There's an estimation, I couldn't find an exact figure, but that around about 60% of the working population are actually working from home at the moment, which means that we're not near Oxford Street, we're not near the Bullring, we're not near, you know, Worcester High Street and so on. We're actually sat at home. There is a chance potentially that more local small town high streets might benefit from this, like for example where I live in Bromsgrove, you know, sort of those small town high streets tend to be much closer to the residential areas, and that might mean that if we carry on in this home working habit that we're beginning to form, that maybe the balance between town centre and small town centres might actually change at some point in the future. The other thing, and finally, of course, is that there are financial concerns that are beginning to edge their way through. But again, I'm going to stop talking about that. I'll come back onto it later. The net result of all of this, obviously, is that a quick bounce back is not really going to be happening. We're already witnessing that. But there are conflicting perspectives. Different people feel different ways. These are just some comments that came from a piece of research I did in the early part of COVID, when, you know, sort of shops hadn't opened wholesale at that time, and you had the people in the purple saying, you know, wouldn't touch them with a barge pole, safer not to, don't really want to be doing it, versus the other people who tended to be younger, tended to be more male, a bit more gung-ho. Come on, let's get out there, let's stop this silliness, you know, sort of I can look after myself, I want to get out there, I want to enjoy shopping again. So there are differences between different cohorts, different types of people, and therefore how businesses respond to those differences, you know, it won't be a one-size-fits-all game from that point of view. But what I'm fairly convinced about is that it will be a game where we are going to see a rebalance and obviously a merging of the digital and the physical retail channels in shoppers' lives. So it won't continue into the future as an either or. We'll see online and physical and social media and all of those different channels merge into one shopping journey. And it's really important for those people that are engaged in retail, as I'm sure you know already if you are, excuse me, that looking towards a multi-channel or an omni-channel relationship with customers is absolutely imperative as a way to come out successfully from this position that we're in now. But actually, I was on a webinar this morning by a company, a social media consultancy company called Maybe, and they were saying remarkably actually that although they've seen some great examples of small independent businesses engaging very successfully with social media to develop their digital brand, over the course of this whole period, the actual overall commercial social media post traffic on Twitter, Facebook and LinkedIn, I think, no, it wasn't LinkedIn, Instagram, they said, had actually declined during lockdown, probably because of lack of resource, perhaps, but actually such a missed opportunity, because actually for those businesses that have a physical presence as well, using those channels to woo people back into store will be just one of a number of different tools that are going to be needed to get people to come back onto the high street. And creative efforts will be required to do that. So just before I finish, I'm just going to go through some examples of what we've seen some retailers do and what needs to happen in order to get people back. The first thing, obviously, is positive, rewarding experience these days equals reassurance and safety. But what we tend to be seeing is something of a clinical approach to this taken, particularly amongst the national chains, and there's a lack of humanity and a lack of empathy seen a lot of the time. So you're kind of presented with a stainless steel dripping hand sanitizer stand and some makeshift sort of lane markers and so on, that all actually make an already nervous shopper feel even more nervous and concerned. So those constant clinical reminders that we're seeing may feel like the best rational response, but actually they're probably heightening the anxiety and reducing the enjoyment of that shopping experience. So if you contrast that picture with somewhere like Geiger, who I saw recently, they've got the signs, they've got the social distancing signs, but they're colourful, they're cheery. And on their website, when they were talking to their customers about what was going to happen when they opened, and this was pre-June, they actually couched the safety measure in the context of shopping enjoyment rather than just simply virus avoidance. So new normal shopping experience, not dissimilar to your local supermarket, but much more fun. They're using phrases like allowing you to enjoy all your personal space. And this really does chime with consumers whenever we research consumer communication, actually appealing to the emotion and being positive, and actually sort of kind of getting people to calm down a little bit really does work. Lush is another great example. So rather than that sort of kind of clinical sanitized stand with a dripping nozzle of hand sanitizer at the front of the store, they're offering soap samples, which is great. It's a much more personable way of delivering that safety, and a much more enjoyable way of doing so. So ideas like this are really, really great. And what we've actually heard anecdotally, and my own personal experience as well, to be honest, which I'll share with you, is that independent retailers are doing a much better job of striking that right balance between delivering safety and an enjoyable shopping experience. Whereas store staff in multiple national chains, they're responding to more sterile head office mantras and so on, resulting in a less rewarding experience. So just to give you an example, I was on holiday down in Devon a couple of weeks ago, and I went into Jack Will's, and they were falling over themselves to tell me how I couldn't try anything on before I'd even actually entered the store almost. Whereas when I went to the independent shop next door, the lady there was far more welcoming. She reassured me that I was perfectly fine to try as much as I would like on, and she also reassured me that all of that stuff was going to be taken off sale, steam cleaned before it went back. So I got the safety message, it's clean if I want to try it on, and I got that welcome feeling, and it will be no surprise where I bought my holiday hoodie from. So really, really important to get the tonality of the message right. Safety is obviously therefore paramount, but also it needs to be delivered. You know, simplicity and direction is also really, really key. When we go shopping, we don't go to read War and Peace on various bits of POS material. So actually, the simpler the message, the clearer it is, the more likely it is to have an impact. And although retailers are duty bound to deliver direction these days, you know, it must be done in a way that is actually noticeable. So if the floor decals don't stand out, nobody's going to follow the one-way system. If the instructions are too wordy, they're not going to read it. Actually, pictures work better than words. And if you really want to get into it and you really want to use words, then lowercase works better than uppercase, because our brain reads word shapes rather than individual letters. And there's some classic examples, well, classically awful examples, in fact, because be careful what the message is that you're sending. You know, this is really quite unbelievable. Retailers are not there to be obeyed. You know, who wants to have a master-slave relationship with their customers? Great from a point of view of standout. Every customer is going to see this, but they're not going to be particularly impressed. The other thing is actually managing stress levels. They're nervous and they feel stressed. And particularly if they're having to spend an awful lot of time in the company of others within what might be a distance of 2 meters or 1 meter plus, whatever that may mean, with a lot of people queuing. So queuing is a notoriously anxiety-inducing thing that we've all experienced. We're great queuers here in the UK, but we all find it a relatively anxiety-inducing experience. But there are things that retailers could be doing to alleviate that anxiety. So, For example, the psychology of queuing tells us that it's more about the perception than the actuality. So things like providing a distraction for shoppers, so whether there's a digital app that can be used, or just having staff managing the queues. And again, a personal anecdote. I was going to Homebase about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and there was still a queue outside Homebase in Bromsgrove then. And the chap, he just came up and started having a chat with me, asked me what I was there to shop for. He was really helpful. He told me where I needed to go in store to find that. He gave me his opinion as to whether or not, you know, I would find stock of the stuff that I wanted to buy and so on. So he started my shopping experience before I got into the store, and therefore it stopped my queuing experience and made the whole process a lot less stressy and anxious for me. So people really just want to get started. So that's what that's all about. And also tell them how long they're going to be waiting, unless they can see how many people there are in front of them. If you know how long you're going to be waiting, it feels a lot shorter than if there is uncertainty involved in that. So there's a lot of things that retailers can do, or, you know, sort of those involved in hospitality and so on can do to reduce the anxiety and the stress that come from the fact that we can't all be in the same place at once as we used to be able to. And the final thing is shopper engagement, and this, I fear, is the thing that lots of people are forgetting about completely right now, yet it is the thing that provides that differentiation between shopping in a store versus shopping online. It's that personal involvement, it's that experiential element, and if we don't get back to delivering that experience, then the road back to the high street footfalls of old will be much, much longer. So safety reassurances will, and people are already telling us this, you know, sort of, I expect there to be a clear one-way system. I expect there to be hand sanitizers. That's no longer enough to make me go into one store or another. I also want on top of that other things that will make that visit worthwhile. I partner with another company called Decode Marketing, which are a behavioral science company. And we did a survey in Germany, in fact, a few weeks ago, where we were looking at the unmet needs of shoppers as they travel through this, you know, the results of this pandemic and the various lockdown measures that are in place. And although down at the bottom there, you'll see safety is still paramount, people are also yearning for independence, which means that, you know, sort of carving their own route, joy and optimism, and underneath those words are things like discovery and inspiration, and that's what people want if we want to draw them back into the high street. So one way of doing that, of course, is to deliver solutions, and just some examples of great solutions delivery. So this is actually off John Lewis's website because I couldn't get into store, but I know that they're doing very similar things. So here, you know, so they've got the messaging as well, no reservations needed, create an at-home bar, referencing the fact that we're staying at home a lot more these days. And these sorts of displays, and I'm sure you'll all be familiar, are exactly the sorts of displays that we've grown to expect when we go into a John Lewis store. Lush, another example from them. So they have, they've gone down the phygital route. I really, really hate that word, physical, digital, but anyway, they've got an app called the Lush Lens app, which you can point at particularly their unpackaged pictures, and it will tell you all you need to know about those products, what's in them, what you use them for, how much they cost, and whatever. And that means you can be in store, you don't have to touch anything you don't want to touch that other people might have touched. You don't even have to interact with staff if you feel a bit nervous about getting too close and personal with people in what are often fairly small spaces in Lush stores, but it's a great way of delivering that engagement by merging different communication channels. And this, the final example, great example, this was in my local Asda a few weeks ago, and it's a very seductive display because it's got everything there. It's extra special, it's got the wine, it's got the starters, it's got the desserts and everything, and obviously the colour purple is you know, sort of speaks indulgence from a semiotic point of view. Not only, however, did it provide that exciting solution, and it was really popular, it took me ages to actually stand and wait for customers to leave the display before I could take this photo, but it's also actually talking to that safety need that people have as well, because it's delivering that one solution there and there. I can pick my wine, I can pick my pudding, I can pick my starter and my main course, all within the space of 3 or 4 minutes, or without having to move around the store. So it's increasing my sense of security as well. So that's a great display. And finally, unfortunately, when I was on holiday, I neglected to take a picture of this A board that was outside an independent shop. There's nothing wrong with bringing a smile to shoppers' faces, to actually bring a bit more lightheartedness to the situation that is currently, sort of people feeling a little bit sort of kind of nervous and a little bit sort of, should I really be out here at all? Even now, people are still feeling like that. I didn't manage to grab a picture of this, but I was thoroughly impressed by it, and I was embarrassingly seduced by it, because I left the store with this jumper. And it worked, because it was a moment of humour. It was a very simple message, and it actually sort of talked to the reason I go shopping. If this is said, if this were in an A board out there saying, we are doing a great job of keeping you safe, come into store, it really would not have had the same impact. So before I finish, we can't leave without talking about the economy, and you probably are following these stats as much as I am, and so I don't need to tell you that it's all looking a little bit dire at the moment. But what is slightly concerning is that some work done by another agency is showing that we are struggling as individuals to internalise the potential impact of that right now. So whilst, actually concern over the economy has declined since the beginning of all of this, concern over personal finances and ability to earn a wage has declined since the beginning of all of this. But what's more telling is that our concern over our own personal situation is significantly lower than our concern over the economy at large. It's a well-known psychological bias called optimism bias. It's that thing that will make us all think it'll never happen to me. But of course, unfortunately, as it already has for a number of people, it will start to happen to more of us. Hopefully we won't be redundant, but certainly we're going to find that personal finances might get a little bit stretched, more than usual, more than we'd like them to. So what we think is going to happen in the second half of this year, and certainly moving into the final quarter, is that the rather depressed spending patterns that we have seen may actually depress even further, just in time for Christmas, which is not great, obviously. So that makes it even more important for those people out there now trying to get their share of wallet off consumers and shoppers, that they do as much now to generate and maintain that relationship with those customers and make themselves be the place or the product or the brand of choice, because there'll be less money to go around to share across all of the different brands and the places and the retailers in time to come. There is an alternative theory to this. I haven't documented it here, but actually there is a theory that I was discussing with a few colleagues and in my network yesterday, which is it is possible that come Christmas that we all have this sod it attitude, and that after months of deprivation that we might use Christmas as a let's just let loose time, knowing full well that that might well be the last time we can do that for a few months as we move into potential second peak in January and so on. Jury's out on that one, but the economic indicators are that sort of people haven't quite realised yet what's to come, and there is a really important note to watch out as to what happens when they do. So that's it really from me. The last thing I want to say is that there are a number of plausible futures. We don't know how this thing is going to land. It all depends on whether it's going to peak again, or depends on what our economy is going to do, and that economy depends, our economy, particularly in the UK, depends on consumer spending, and so everything is interrelated. So several plausible futures, but each and every one of them starts now, and the job really that we need to do as businesses, and for me in particular on behalf of my clients, is to actually keep abreast of which of those futures is actually beginning to appear. And that means talking to customers, walking alongside them, traveling the journey with them, even helping them to co-create, asking them to co-create a future with you, and being adaptive. People are always talking about lean business, agility, and so on. There's never been a more important time to be agile and adaptive in responding to what we've already seen are changing consumer needs. So if I'll just make one prediction, is that if I sat here in 3 months' time talking about this again with you, consumer behaviour would have changed again in much the same way as it's changed already relative to what I was talking about 2 or 3 months ago in another webinar. So that's me. Thank you very much. So I'm going to stop sharing now. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Yep.
That's perfect. Well, thank you so much, Iona. Some really interesting research there, and I hope everyone enjoyed that. There aren't any questions in the chat box as yet, so if you would like to ask Iona a question, then please just pop it in there now. Or if it's a long question, please just unmute yourself, and you can speak that way. That's fine as well. But just wanted to say thank you so much, Iona. I thought that was a really good presentation, and some really interesting information that's been given there. So thank you. Just while we're waiting and see if any questions are going to be said, we've got some upcoming webinars this week that I'd like to share with you. Oh, we've got a hand up. Marcus, I'm going to come to you first, if that's okay.
Thanks very much, Iona. Very interesting to see what is happening with the high street. Do you see long-term a place for the high street in future shopping, or do you think we're going to see its continued gradual decline?
I wish I had a crystal ball. A lot of people are predicting continued demise, and obviously, as I said earlier, physical retail high streets are already in pain, and they're now in agony. But there are several things that can change with that. Particularly if the pattern of our lives change. Sort of the high streets that were drawing the footfall previously, the bigger town centres, the city centres, may well suffer more because we kind of work more from home and that sort of thing. But the likes of Bromsgrove or Redditch town centres that are closer to residential areas may benefit from that, because actually there is a place for both channels. Nobody wants to see a future where there are no shops. But what we will be seeing, as I said, is that merger of, having that one relationship between the provider and the consumer, if you like, that can continue from online to social media to being in the store. And I think, we'll see a lot of retailers fall off the edge because they can't deliver that. And therefore the high street will suffer. And of course, when you've got the big footfall drivers, the M&S's, the Debenhamses and whatever of this world disappearing off our high street, that also has an impact. But there's a lot of activity going on in terms of place management now that we'll probably see a regeneration that involves more than just retail in our high streets. But hopefully that will be a planned regeneration and won't result in, just having a whole host of charity shops and betting shops and a couple of arcades instead of the shops that we've all grown to love. So yes, I think there is a future. It will look different, but as human beings, we like to interact. So we won't want to be just sort of transacting online.
Yeah, thanks very much, Iona. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Good question, Marcus. Thank you. So I believe that is the only question we have. I will be sending around Iona's contact details as well if anyone has a question at a later date. So just before you all go, I just wanted to reel out some of our upcoming webinars. So tomorrow, 12 till 1, we've got our lunchtime networking. Tomorrow, 3 till 4, we've got responding to change. Tuesday, 3 till 4, we've got how to increase sales online. And then Wednesday, 10 to 11, we've got local labour market update. They're all free for members to join. So if you'd like to book onto any of those, then please do email me or the events inbox, and we can process that for you. But we've had some really nice comments in the chat box for you, Iona. So thank you so much. Thanks for joining, everyone, and take care. Have a good afternoon. Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.